Hey guys, Coach Potch here. Thanks for joining me for this week's video cast. Today we're looking at the first chapter from our textbook, Robert Strayer's Ways of the World. Chapter 1 is called First Peoples, First Farmers, most of history in a single chapter to 4000 BCE. And you'll note there is no beginning date there, and that's actually kind of a significant issue there. In the opening section of the chapter, Strayer gives a brief depiction of the Hadza people in what is now Tanzania, and he points out that traditionally most narratives of world history begin with the first cities and civilizations, and they leave out the story of those people who were hunters and gatherers, whose lifeways go back to the Paleolithic age. Strayer definitely thinks this is wrong, and in fact, the textbook begins with the story of Paleolithic peoples. And an important question for you to think about as we go through this: what are the two important developments, at least according to Strayer, that occurred before the first cities and civilizations? In other words, what happened before the sort of traditional accounting of world history? Why are they important in this story, and what impact did they have on future generations? And finally, should they be included in the story? And obviously that's an opinion question, and that's something you're going to have to decide for yourself by the end of the week. In the first section, Out of Africa to the Ends of the Earth, he points out that there are several theories of where humans first developed and how they spread over the entire globe. We're going to look more closely at those in class. For now, suffice it to say that it appears Homo sapiens developed in Africa around 250,000 years ago. Having certain biological advantages, such as bipedalism, helped these early humans, but above all else, it was the power of collective learning that helped them adapt over time. The use of stone tools, for example, gave early humans a distinct ability to manipulate the environment. This ability to adapt to new environments allowed some humans to emigrate from Africa and immigrate into Eurasia around 100,000 years ago. The first migrations out of Africa were into the Middle East and then into South Asia. Starting around 45,000 years ago, another series of migrations saw humans moving into Northern Europe and East Asia. Around 20,000 years ago, colder Ice Age temperatures forced humans into Southern Europe. Moving southwards, humans developed spears, bows, arrows, and stone tools to hunt reindeer, horses, and other game. These tools also appear to have been modified for use as weapons against other humans, but only rarely. The earliest existing records of representative human communication mostly represent animals in human forms, but also some abstract symbols. Some female figures with exaggerated proportions are found throughout Eurasia, raising the possibility of a widespread network of human communication. Given the enormous size of Eurasia, it is perhaps not so surprising that it took humans many tens of thousands of years to fully colonize it. But what is surprising is how early these first migrants reached Australia. Indeed, early humans who had reached Southeast Asia appear to have launched boats from Indonesia into Australia around 60,000 years ago, well before they colonized Europe. Even as humans colonized this new continent, their numbers were few, only about 300,000 people by the time Europeans arrived in 1778 of the Common Era. Even so, the diversity of language is staggering, as there were approximately 250 different native languages spoken at the time. Australian Aborigines, the native peoples of the continent, have a concept called Dreamtime that expresses a world outlook in which human activity and knowledge in the continent's natural environments of rocks, rivers, and waterholes. This is a form of spirituality we will explore in the next unit when we examine the rise of religion. Human habitation of the Americas may be less surprising than that of Australia, but is much more controversial. Conflicting evidence has created some very heated debates about the first Americans. While it is still very hotly contested among archaeologists, the best available evidence at this time suggests that humans used land bridges created by colder temperatures and lower sea levels. They may also have used small boats to travel along what would have been the Pacific coast at the time. These migrations appear to have begun around 30,000 to 15,000 years ago, but we know that by around 12,500 years ago, they had reached the southern point of the Americas in what is now Chile. However, the first clearly defined and widespread culture of the Americas is known as the Clovis culture. It is named after a common type of spearhead called a Clovis point that is found all over North America. It was used by Clovis people to hunt large animals. Shortly after the Clovis culture appeared, large animals that had been common in North America, like the horse and woolly mammoth, began to disappear. It is unclear why these extinctions happened. Perhaps it was overhunting, or perhaps it was climate change. Perhaps it was both or neither. Regardless, the Clovis culture soon disappeared as well. After the American megafaunal extinction and the disappearance of the Clovis culture, humans adapted to various ecological niches, with some remaining mobile hunters and gatherers, while others developed early forms of agriculture and eventually urbanization. While most of the world had been populated well before the Common Era, many of the islands in the South Pacific were completely unknown to humans until the last millennium. The last great wave of human migrations into completely unknown land came from Southeast Asia to all corners of the Pacific and from Indonesia to Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, and showed exceptional seamanship and navigational skills. Unlike earlier migrations, these were done by agricultural people who had already domesticated plants with the intention of finding new lands and creating new communities. Along with food crops, they also brought with them the associated pattern of highly stratified societies. The introduction of domesticated plants and animals, along with the overuse of native species such as the moa in New Zealand and many large trees in Rapa Nui, which we know as Easter Island, resulted in massive man-made extinctions of flora and fauna throughout the Pacific region, known as Oceania. We'll study the last wave of these great Austronesian migrations, called the Polynesian migrations, in a later unit. In this map, you can see a depiction of the routes that humans took out of Africa. A couple things to note. First of all, the purple areas are areas that were covered in ice at the time of the last ice age. The ice captured a great deal of water, and so it lowered ocean levels that allowed for areas where humans might be able to move in places that would now be subsumed by water. So now that we have seen how humans came to populate nearly the entire landmass of the planet, we're left to ask, how exactly did the earliest humans live in this period known as the Paleolithic era, or early Stone Age? The social structures of Paleolithic peoples were very different from our own. For example, Paleolithic humans lived in small bands of 25 to 50 people organized by family ties or kinship, in which a group of elders decided what was best for the community as a whole. Small numbers and relatively little accumulated wealth made these Paleolithic communities very egalitarian or equal, with little social stratification and relative equality between the sexes. Men and women had different but equally important roles. Typically, men hunted and women gathered, but both were equally valued. However, without formal state systems, interpersonal violence was common in the Paleolithic world, and the community as a whole might punish a wrongdoer with a very gruesome death. The ways in which Paleolithic peoples worked and played were also quite different from ours. Hunting and gathering required far fewer work hours than now, allowing people more leisure time because they had limited needs to be met. Consequently, they had more time for their families, for songs and stories, and for simply looking up at the stars at night and imagining the heavens. And yet, Paleolithic peoples made a huge impact on the environment, as they needed to feed their growing families. Fire starting and mass hunting represented an early human alteration of the landscape and species, including in some cases extinctions of whole species of animals. We will go into more detail about the spiritual life of Paleolithic peoples in class later on, but suffice it to say now that Paleolithic peoples definitely included spirituality into their lifeways. While it is very difficult to research the spiritual beliefs and practices of prehistoric peoples, there is clear evidence of specific sites such as caves and burial sites associated with various forms of spiritual ceremonies. And while there were a wide range of spiritual beliefs in these early cultures, there was a strong feminine dimension that concerned the regeneration and renewal of life. Thus, natural cycles of life, death, and rebirth influenced early forms of spirituality. Late in the Paleolithic era, around 16,000 years ago, global warming indicated the beginning of the end of the last ice age. This led to a kind of transitional period, which we will call the Mesolithic era or Middle Stone Age in class. Note that Strayer doesn't actually use the term Mesolithic in the textbook, but it is a term we will use in our activities in the classroom. As humans developed better technologies in the Paleolithic world, they eventually learned to harvest wild grains more effectively. Microblades allowed more precision and dexterity for human work. Better spear points were developed, as were better knives, scrapers, and arrowheads. A warming trend in the long-term natural climate cycles altered the habitats of plants and animals, allowing many who had the technology to gather grains and hunt certain animals more effectively to flourish. This allowed some humans to settle down and create permanent dwellings, such as the Hamon cultures in Japan and the inhabitants of the longhouses of Labrador. In southwestern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe is built of massive limestone pillars, about 16 tons worth, placed in a set of circles and decorated with carvings of animals. It is the product of a hunting and gathering people who spent the better part of the year settled at a particular site. Settlements allowed for population growth, but these larger communities needed more food, thus placing greater demand on the environment and creating a need to increase the food supply. Consequently, the environment, and indeed human life, would be altered irrevocably. The second great human process after the migration out of Africa is the transition to the domestication of plants and animals in the Neolithic era, or New Stone Age. In this era, stone tools were used to harvest plants and protect livestock from predators instead of gathering and hunting. This led to intensification, meaning more food could be produced from less land, and it allowed humans to remain more or less sedentary. The various Neolithic societies that developed around the world had several things in common. While global warming started 16,000 years ago, by about 10,000 BCE, the Ice Age was over, creating warmer, wetter, and more stable conditions for human settlement and allowing for the flourishing of plants and plant-eating animals that would soon be domesticated. As traditional plant gatherers, women likely led the way towards developing agriculture. As hunters, men likely led the way towards animal domestication. But as the importance of hunting decreased, the status of men was decreased as well. Consequently, new gender roles would be assigned and the rise of patriarchy would follow. And this is a key concept that we're going to come back to over and over again in class, the idea of patriarchy. The warmer climate at the end of the Ice Age may have allowed a dramatic population growth of hunter-gatherer communities, thus necessitating a more abundant and stable food supply. Farming may have come after developing a sedentary way of life. Regardless, sometime around 12,000 years ago, agriculture developed independently in the Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia, several places in sub-Saharan Africa, China, New Guinea, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and eastern North America. It appears to have happened separately without any cultural diffusion. Within the context of 250,000 years of human history, it was surprisingly simultaneous. While there were similarities among early Neolithic communities, including the use of a new tool that we call a hoe, not a plow hasn't been developed yet, there were nonetheless significant differences. For example, geographical dispersion of various plants and animals suitable for domestication was quite varied and determined the path to domestication in a given region. However, due to climate changes and human migrations as well, grains suitable for cultivation and animals suitable for domestication in the Middle East saw a rapid transition to settled farming. South and East Asia had a similar growing season to the Middle East, but with the monsoons it was much wetter. Consequently, different plants and animals were available for domestication, such as rice and the water buffalo. With a dramatically different climate than contemporary Africa, the Sahara Desert, for example, what's now a desert, was wetter and fit for human habitation at the time. Multiple sites of agriculture developed south of the Sahara, each exploiting plants and or animals adapted to the specific region. Lacking the cereal grains of the Fertile Crescent, the Americas saw the development of maize, which we call corn, in Mesoamerica and potatoes in the Andes over a period of several thousand years. With the exception of the llama, the Americas lacked suitable animals for domestication. This was in sharp contrast to Eurasia. This map is a depiction of the spread of the agriculture of plants and the domestication of animals throughout the world. A couple of things to note. First of all, that they start in various areas. Even though there's a timeline, for example, we know it started earliest in what we now call the Fertile Crescent. It started independently in several areas and then sort of radiated out from there. It was not the case that it started in one area and then spread out through the rest of the globe. Also note, too, on these that you've got both plants and animals that were domesticated to create what we will call the Neolithic Revolution in the next section. Just as humans would eventually cover the entire globe in the Paleolithic era, so too would the new practices of cultivation of plants and domestication of animals in the Neolithic era. The spread of agriculture would triumph in many places throughout the world, but it was resisted in others. The Neolithic Revolution spread by diffusion, a process in which a new way of doing things would be adapted and adopted by nearby communities. But it also spread by continued migration, which involved new lifeways being forced on conquered peoples or the complete displacement of existing communities as a whole. In either case, cultural diffusion would also spread certain ideas along with practices of farming. But some people resisted agriculture for environmental reasons. For some, their land was not well suited for it, but for others, the land was so abundant that they did not need farming. They would rather continue their hunter-gatherer life ways. Even others who had domesticated animals would nonetheless resist agriculture or farming plants. Pastoral nomads, for example, would not accept a sedentary life way, preferring their nomadic culture. However, settled agricultural communities were often incompatible with hunter-gatherer groups, leading sometimes to violent displacement. Some pre-agricultural societies were changed by exposure to technology and epidemic diseases, while others intermarried with members of the new settled societies. Some were merely conquered into submission. Wherever agriculture took root, however, dramatic changes took place in the way people lived. There were 6 million people in the world 10,000 years ago. 50 million people 5,000 years ago, and 250 million people 2,000 years ago. Population growth is an issue that plagues us even more so today. More humans meant a greater impact on the planet, specifically human selection of favorable plants and animals. Early examples of overuse of land were soil erosion and deforestation. Agricultural life initially led to shorter life expectancy. People had a shorter physical stature and were plagued by tooth decay, anemia, and malnutrition. Relying on small numbers of crops and animals also meant these communities were vulnerable to famine brought on by crop failure or drought. There was an explosion of technological development, such as pottery, jewelry, weaponry, and tool making. Animals were used for secondary purposes, such as hides, wool, milking, and transport. Soon metallurgy would replace stone tool making, leading to even more social stratification. Wine and beer became common between 5,400 years BCE and 4000 BCE, as did rowdy behavior. Drunken behavior among the aristocracy prompted an unsuccessful effort by one Chinese ruler around 1046 BCE to outlaw wine. The Mesopotamians and Egyptians, on the other hand, regarded beer as a symbol of civilization itself. All of these changes associated with the domestication of plants and animals led to new types of social organization. One of these was the development of pastoral nomads. Arctic tundra, deserts, and grasslands were generally not favorable to settled agriculture, but they were good for animal husbandry. Consequently, pastoral nomads focused on the milk, meat, and blood of animals for the bulk of their diet instead of domesticated plants. Pastoral nomad communities moved about with their animals looking for seasonally appropriate and unexploited grazing lands. Consequently, they developed lifeways that were mobile and that were opposed to the sedentary lifeways of agriculturalists who built villages. Age-old conflict existed between the wealthier settled communities and the nomadic herders, with their mobile yet poorer communities desirous of the wealth and diverse products of the villages, towns, and later cities. A second social variation can be seen in agrarian villagers. This was the most widespread in the Neolithic era. Ties to social patterns of hunting and gathering communities of the Paleolithic era continued in those of Neolithic communities that did without formal state systems of kings, chiefs, and bureaucrats. The importance of female work in farming and textile work gave women social importance in these early Neolithic societies. Indeed, early agriculturalists favored women as the model of fertility, as we will explore more closely in class. However, without a formal state system, extended family ties linked people together with elders exercising authority, and this sometimes created the opportunity for the abuse of power. A third variation involves the development of agricultural chiefdoms, not to be confused with kingdoms. In these Neolithic societies, political power came not from physical force or violence, but by giving gifts, performing religious and political rituals, and most frequently from personal charisma or charm. Chiefs frequently combined the sacred and the political in their dealings with the public. As no one wanted to be condemned by the spirits, chiefs became more and more powerful. Chiefs collected food and manufactured items from the commoners and redistributed them to the warriors. This would be the earliest form of taxation and also the need for the earliest forms of writing that would be a hallmark of the first civilizations that we will explore in the next chapter. In the end of the book, the end of the chapter, Strayer sort of reflects back on the issues raised at the opening section. He raises the issue earlier: what are the two important developments that occurred before the first cities and civilizations, where traditional world history narratives begin? The first of these, as I'm sure you figured out, human migrations throughout the world in the Paleolithic era. How humans populated the whole world is the first of these developments. The second is the domestication of plants and animals in the Neolithic era, the development of the agricultural life way that will become the basis for civilization itself. Why are they important in the story of world history? What impact did they have on future generations? Well, here's the thing. As you go through the rest of the chapter for the rest of the week and you read it, keep these questions in mind as you read. They're sort of touchstones that we're going to come back periodically throughout the week in class, but then also that you're going to want to answer as you are actually reading the chapter. And finally, should they be included in the story? Well, look, Strayer obviously thinks so. I mean, he puts them in the first chapter. The chapter says beginnings as the starting point for his periodization. But here's a question I want you to stop and think about. What about David Christian? If you look at the infographic that you did where he divides the era, what do you think David Christian would say about it? Does he think that these should be part of the story of world history or not? And what about the College Board? If you look at the key concepts on the outside of your notebook, do you think the College Board agrees with that? Give that some thought before you come to class at the beginning of the week. But finally, what about you? Do you think that these two great developments are important enough to be considered part of the story of world history? Keep those questions in mind. I'm not expecting you to create a formal answer at this point, but as we learn more about these by the end of the week, I hope you will have accumulated enough information to formulate a personal response and opinion on that particular topic. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope you were able to fill in everything on the chapter outline, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class. In the meantime, have a great day.